welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Roster. And CAISO Sex and Gender Justice recently launched a model LGBTI plus workplace policy for Trinidad and Tobago. To speak to that, we are joined by Omar Mohammed, a CAISO Director. We also have Rae Alibey, CAISO Wholeness and Justice Caseworker and Trans Coalition, Ryan Assiu, Advisors Next Door Director, and Director for CAISO as well, Angelique v. Nixon. We say welcome, and getting right into the heart of it, we're starting with you, please, Omar, asking why is the adoption of a model policy important for Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, thanks so much, DK. I think it's important for a variety of reasons. One, I think, is the sort of underlying moral reason, the human rights reason, in that everyone deserves to, work in an environment that respects their human rights. And of course, we have the right to live in a country that also respects our human rights. As well, it's also part of the case for a more resilient business ecosystem. Businesses right now are suffering, especially around the COVID-19 issue. And for us to get back on our feet economically, we need to harness the talents of everyone in Trinidad and Tobago, regardless of their sexual orientation, who they choose to love. And the adoption of the model policy provides businesses with a roadmap towards getting their best talent on board and to making sure that whoever is in those workplaces feels safe and secure and able to, truly express and live to their fullest potential.
And I like the fact that you spoke about business. And with that, Ryan, I want to pull you in, please. Speaking to and just to kind of elaborate on some of what Omar was talking about, how does a policy like this help businesses move forward in a positive way?
Fantastic question. This policy and policies like these that stimulate inclusivity and help protect and respect the dignity of the employees help businesses in a number of ways. The first one, as Omar pointed out, is that when employers respect the dignity of their employees, employees are not only happier at work, but they feel safer, they have a stronger sense of camaraderie, they are more creative in their work, and they also contribute more because they're allowed to bring their whole selves to work. What this translates to is it translates to the bottom line, fundamentally. You find that companies, and many studies have shown this internationally, that companies that have inclusivity policies have more innovation and also have more profits. And we have seen this even locally as we started to adopt this policy. I'm fortunate to know a wide range of businesses across many sectors who have become early adopters, and they've recognized that the moral sense of doing it because it's right, and also the business sense because it translates to more gains, it all adds up. So we have companies in healthcare, in manufacturing, in food, photography, who have all become early adopters and are already seeing some of the gains in this regard.
Well, I'm glad you were able to say that, because one of the things that I want to do, apart from playing devil's advocate, is choke some fire, in the sense that saying, okay, where were these studies done, and would they have taken cultures, climates, economies of scales like ours into consideration when making those studies, and saying that this sort of inclusion, adoption of these sort of policies would lead to an increase in the bottom line?
That's a great question. So some of these studies, and the more recent ones, which are done by very reputable management consulting firms, you're talking about firms like Deloitte and others, done within the past couple of years. The most recent one I recall is in 2020. They talk about, and whilst these studies are done in economies that are more developed, places like the US and the UK, definitely not in a Caribbean context where this is still relatively new. We're still playing catch up in this regard. In those countries, we see the results where they have looked at companies that are both massive. So you look at, for instance, Fortune 500 companies, where about, I think it's 82% of them have policies that are inclusive to LGBT, and have seen gains for that. And even smaller scale companies still see those as well.
And I want to bring you in now, please, Rae. And if we boil it down like Baji, and if go down to brass tacks, and somebody asks the question, why do we need a policy like this? What would you tell them?
Well, thank you for that question. Well, I'll take as a point of departure, I will have to support all that Ryan has said. But from the human perspective, when you have employees, who feel included in the company, they are more likely to demonstrate increased job satisfaction, increased productivity, which of course will lead to increased competitiveness for that company. As a human being working in a company that recognizes their gender identity or their sexual orientation, that actually is to reduce stress. Reduce stress means that these people can actually work better, contribute better. Employees have a way that they get together and they talk. They have a barbecue on the weekend. They come together on Monday morning and they talk about the things that they did or they did with their partners, and it builds a kind of cohesiveness, group cohesiveness within the business. But if you have someone who is LGBT and they are excluded from that conversation, or they feel threatened if they have that conversation, people make negative comments, little microaggressions like "that's so gay," or "we don't support that here." That person now feels diminished self-esteem. That person doesn't feel as they could bring their best to the workplace. So reduce stress needs to reduce anxiety, reduce health problems, increase productivity. The individual feels a better sense of self-esteem, job satisfaction. Um, it really is unkind to have persons who are transgendered to have to dress or perform in a gender identity that is very different from how they conceive themselves to be. That sort of duplicity does not allow the individual to be their whole authentic self. And how could you how can you be a whole person or be friends with anybody if you're spending most of your time hiding or trying to be other than who you are? It is very, very unkind. So yes, we need this workplace policy because as we increase diversity in the workplace globally and locally, managers are going to need new skill sets as well to know how to manage diversity, because if the diversity goes unmanaged, there could be lots of problems. So the policy itself speaks to that, addresses that, and also brings out the humanity of the LGBT persons. You don't start being a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago just because you're LGBT.
All right, now we're going to speak to some of those factors in the policy. When we return, we take a short break. Angelique, I haven't forgotten you. We're starting off with you on the other half. Stay with us. We come back with more. Welcome back. We are speaking about the model LGBTI plus workplace policy for Trinidad and Tobago, recently launched by CAISO Sex and Gender Justice. And Angelique Nixon, in terms of that launch, the launch event was entitled Finding an Equal Place at Work. It featured individuals like Harriet Cross, High Commissioner of the United Kingdom to Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the Chairman of the Equal Opportunity Commission, Mr. Ian Roach. Now, one of the things that the High Commissioner said is that this would be an opener, a method of engagement to have discussions, start important discussions with staff. And Rae spoke about managers having more tools in their toolbox, in their resources. What about, how does that clash in terms of like those two sorts of methods, in terms of increased discussions with staff versus a model that is more akin to don't ask, don't tell?
Well, this policy, I want to make clear that CAISO did local research grounded in our region and in our local context with consultants from Arthur Lockjack. And we also did focus groups and engaged with LGBT plus community members, as well as organizations, as well as employers. And so this model policy is really grounded in our context. And as the chair of the Equal Opportunity Commission said, we're filling in a gap. The Equal Opportunity Act does not include LGBTI status at all. We've been asking for that, and in fact, it explicitly excludes sexual orientation. So the private sector, as well as public sectors, have been contained. They cannot address and deal with issues related to LGBTI status. We're waiting for the appeal process to go through with the Jones versus TT case. Even though we have decriminalization, we need legislation that protects LGBTI plus people in a variety of ways, especially the workplace. And so this policy offers, CAISO said, well, we need to fill this gap and we need to ensure that LGBT people experience safety, and also we want companies to have the tools. And so this model policy offers employers in all kinds of workplaces. We are right now targeting the private sector, but we also hope that many workplaces will adopt this policy and include it in their workplaces to ensure diversity and inclusion and really ensure the human rights of all. And as Rae and Ryan and Omar have already said, this is not only about excellence and diversity, in the workplace to have a safe and enabling environment, but this is also about human rights, getting the same protections that everyone else has in Trinidad and Tobago.
And I want to ask you, Angelique or Omar, what are some of those significant mileposts along the timeline of crafting this policy?
Well, I guess I can take that one. So this policy actually started way back in late 2019. So we were approached to, again, help fill that gap that currently existed in the support structure, especially for private sector institutions around, LGBTI employees and model behavior. So we were lucky enough to get some financial support from the British High Commission. And with that, we were able to engage 2 consultants from the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. And those 2 consultants kicked off a 4-month exercise wherein they did a range of different literature reviews around legislation, best practice policy, both in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the region and globally as well. And then we sort of downscaled that search to see what bits and pieces were most applicable to us in our context. And they crafted an initial skeleton, which we then focus grouped with persons from the LGBTI community as well as private sector employers to really see if we can meet in the middle to see what can be done to best suit the needs of the community, but also to understand what the existing business environment could actually support. So we were able to create this first draft, which sort of helped to meet the needs of both parts of this equation. And then we worked with the Equal Opportunity Commission to really deep dive into the policy, to really look at the legislation aspects of it, which will actually play out in the real world. And then that policy was then shopped around with different experts in human resources, in law, in internal sort of communications with companies. And then we got a lot of feedback and troubleshooting on the policy, which lasted several months after the development of that initial first draft policy. So we were meant to launch, of course, in 2020, but like everything else, things got drawn out because of the COVID-19 situation. And we were lucky enough to actually be approached by Open Business, which was another initiative that really was looking at the LGBTI workforce and the Caribbean in particular. So while we were not really have the benefit of sort of local economic research, we did have this Open for Business report, which was aiming to be launched around sort of June 2021, which was looking at the first ever economic review of the cost of LGBTI discrimination to Caribbean economies. So they came to us because they were familiar with the policy, and we said, yes, let's work together, let's launch these policies and this report together to sort of really correspond to one another. So with that, we set a date for the end of June 2021, and we were lucky enough to get almost 15 early adopter champions within a very short space of time, and that's grown now to some extent. And we're looking forward to kicking off the rest of 2021, hopefully expanding that number of champions to a much higher number.
Now, I like the fact that you mentioned 2 things that I want to follow up a little bit on, please. One of them being the early adopter champions, and I want to talk about them in just a bit, or have you all speak to them. But before that, drafting is one thing. It's all well and good, fine and dandy, but it's another thing when that process or that draft is reviewed. So I'm happy that you said that, okay, well, it was looked at, it was reviewed. Was there a lot of tweaking from the review, from the focus groups? What kind of things needed to be included? What was that process like?
But yeah, there was a lot of tweaking, and as the person who was coordinating it, you know, there were many comments and track changes as the months went along. So we had, of course, we had, let's say we were to have an either or. We would have a policy that was, purely in the camp of the, LGBTI community with all of the issues that we thought would, best represent the community. Or we could have had a policy that was very employer centric, which, maybe said quite little, but we were able to really navigate that and really get the best of both worlds. And that included having conversations about, gender markers, the economic cost for changing infrastructure and what that meant for a business. We then also had a lot of back and forth about, different parts of various legislation that are locally applicable here in Trinidad and Tobago and how that would fit in to the policy. We had lots of conversations about worker versus employee, for example. We had a lot of conversation for, should this policy extend to persons who apply for a job, or should it stop at the walls of the company itself? So there were a lot of conversations around scope, around content, around definitions. Should we call it an LGBTI plus policy? Should we call it an LGBTQ policy? So it's still a living document, because in many cases these things evolve almost as we're actually doing it and coming up with it. So we've always been very clear to say that it is something that will be improved upon, and we're very sure. So I think we can rest assured that it is a comprehensive document, but it's also not a black and white document. It is going to evolve as we learn more, and as it's actually implemented in the real world, like you said. Chances are things might come up. We may have a review in about a year or so, when we actually see how it's being implemented on the ground.
And in terms of that implementation, no, I wish we could dive down even deeper, but one of the things that I want to look at, because you raised the point, where does the policy stop? What are the demarcation lines? Do we consider this for use outside of the business, or is it just within the confines or the physical confines of the business? What does that even mean in a space during the pandemic where so much work is being done remotely and virtually? But before that though, early adopters, Ryan, you're my personal business right about now. In terms of what this can mean for businesses, what can businesses learn? Are there any lessons that you can see being learned from the early adopters already? Or let me ask that differently. What does it say, or what do you think when you say, okay, well, these are the people who have already adopted?
Great, fantastic question. In terms of things businesses could learn, I could use my own business as an example, as a reference point. When we got the policy, we decided to action it, right? And this would maybe feed into what Omar is talking about, lessons learned in the future, and to your question. And one of the things that we did to that extent is we had a gender sensitivity training to help people understand in the workplace, in our team, understand this issue a little bit better. And the way it was formatted is that we had sort of like a open discussion, and we allowed for ideas to come forward. So one of the learnings that we took away is that we were really amazed at the amount of creativity that exists even among your staff and their willingness to accept change. Sometimes at a business level, as a managerial level, you might think to yourself, oh, well, the culture here, they mightn't accept that, or, stakeholders might not accept that. But I was surprised to see how not only how progressively minded people in our team were, but also the ideas that they had in terms of ways that they could make the workplace more inclusive.
And in terms of that willingness to accept change, though, in terms of that willingness to accept change, sadly, even though we may be unwilling, we have to accept the fact that time done on the conversation. But thank you very much, Angelique, Rae, Ryan, and Omar. And hopefully this is something that we can dive a little deeper into as time progresses. And we want to thank you for tuning into the TTT News Special. Have a good one.